missed it, our membership coordinator wanted me to tell you guys that some of you folks might have signed up for memberships last week or this week. She's all caught up now, and so your cards are down at the front desk, so you can stop there and pick up your membership cards. Otherwise, we'll mail them out to you. Let's see, and then at the end of the program, we have coffee and cookies, so everybody's welcome to kind of stay here and partake and visit. The coffee is a donation from Victor Johnson of the Dalles Coffee Company, so it's excellent coffee, so make sure you get a cup. And then also next week, Linda Wilson's going to be displaying some of her yard art creations, so you'll be able to purchase those next week. And also she's got a couple of other items that you can purchase to kind of support the courthouse down near the exit door. So a couple of birdhouses and some metal artwork. So if you're interested in any of those, contact Linda and talk to her about that. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Susan Hare. She's the museum registrar at the Columbia Gorge Discovery Center Museum, which she says makes her in charge of all the stuff there. So, and there is a lot of stuff, and there's a lot of stuff to know. And one of her passions has been researching the Umatilla House Hotel, which was, one of the big institutions here in the Dalles for generations, and it's been gone since the 20s. So she's trying to kind of revive the memory and remind us of just what a significant part of our community it was. So, without further ado, here's Susan. And I also forgot, I'm going to be passing around a bag for donations.
Are you doing that before or after?
Right now I'm going to pass it around.
Okay. Well, I guess my first slide was to introduce myself, and I don't really have to do that now. So I might add that I am extremely hard of hearing. This is a really long talk, so if you've got questions to ask me, you're going to need to wait till after the talk so that you can shout it out or come closer and I can hear it, and that way we won't have to bring things to a screeching halt in the middle of the talk, because I got a lot of history to give to you. All right, so tracking history is like chasing wild rabbits. Let's follow some rabbit trails as we learn about the Umatilla House. My passion for digging up history about the Umatilla House stems from my childhood. My grandparents, Roy and Hattie Johnson, owned a log cabin in eastern Oregon. Or rather, they were partners with a group of hunting buddies who had purchased it in the early 1940s, including Roy's brother Harry, Cecil Byers, Dick Brace, Bill Myers, and Fred Weddle. This photo shows Dick Brace and the man who built the cabin, Elmer Johnson, not a relative. It's always been known as the Johnson cabin. My dad told me the rocking chairs in the living room were bought by Fred Weddle from the Umatilla House when furnishings were sold at auction. Possibly the old wood cook stove as well. And that's my dad sitting in the top picture. Believe it or not, that's me in the middle picture there off to the right with my ex-husband Lee. I grew up spending many weekends at the cabin, eating meals at the table in the breakfast nook with this artwork, the stag at bay looking down on me. Not very appetizing during mealtime, but it also triggered the study of the history of the Umatilla House. I learned they had a copy of this artwork hanging there. It could have been the copy from the Umatilla House that found its way to the cabin through Fred Weddle. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, all of the antiques at that cabin were stolen in a series of break-ins, including the stag at bay. But no one can steal the history of the Umatilla House. So let's look at some of the various stories that are out there. Where to start? I don't claim to be the original scribe of these stories. Much of the history given about the Umatilla House has been copied and repeated over and over by other people. Inaccurate facts and conflicting information tend to spread like wild rabbits. It's not easy to find the right rabbit trail to the truth. The rest will have to be filed under the title, "Did you hear the one about?" Let's start with these two, Nicholas Byrne Sinnott and Daniel Handley. No one can separate the Umatilla House history from the two men whose lives became forever entwined with it. Articles often refer to Nicholas Sinnott as Colonel and Daniel Handley as Major. The titles of both of these men were purely honorary, which was the custom of pioneer times. Historians do agree that Sinnott and Handley were both from Wexford County, Ireland. While historic notes say they didn't know each other until they met in Oregon, their shared origins must have created a bond. Nicholas Byrne Sinnott was born June 1832 near Ogford County, Wexford, Ireland. His parents were Nicholas Sinnott and Mary Byrne Sinnott. He had two older brothers, John and Patrick, and three younger brothers and two sisters. Daniel Handley was born in Enniscorthy County, Wexford, on February 21st, 1830, son of John Handley and Elizabeth Murphy Handley. His father was a carpenter and also kept a cabin at their home on the banks of the river Slaney. Both men were affected by the Great Potato Famine. One account says Handley's father and younger sister died in the famine in 1847. In 1849, in the wake of the famine, Nicholas Sinnott, aged 19 years, and his brother Patrick immigrated to America, first going to Peoria, Illinois, where Nicholas found work in a hotel. After he immigrated to America, Daniel lived in Scranton, Pennsylvania with his younger brother, John. John Handley went on to become a famous Pennsylvania judge held in high reputation, which meant that his life was recorded by a biographer who reported that he immigrated in 1854, came across the Atlantic and ended up in St. Lawrence in Canada. Chances are high that Daniel set sail with his brother. Nicholas later found employment at the Planters Hotel in St. Louis, Missouri, which at that time was the finest hostelry in the Mississippi states. In 1861, he returned to Peoria, where he met his brother, Patrick, who had just returned from a trip to California. Together they started for the Pacific coast, going by the way of the Isthmus of Panama, and reached Portland in March of 1862. In 1862, Nicholas and his brother Patrick Sinnott leased the old Columbia Hotel in Portland. It's uncertain just when or how Daniel Handley became involved, but stories say he too was one of the proprietors of the Columbia Hotel. Surely his experience as a carpenter and a painter made him a valued member of their staff, as well as his background living with his dad who ran a tavern. At the time, Nicholas Sinnott and Dan Handley were both in their early 30s. The Sinnott's cousin, Catherine Kate Byrne, worked for them. Catherine Byrne was born in Chapel, Wexford County, Ireland, and later immigrated to Peoria, Illinois, and moved on to San Francisco, then Oregon, then Portland. The time that Daniel and Kate Byrne spent working together at the Columbia Hotel in Portland blossomed into romance, and in 1863, the two were wed. Let's turn our attention to the early years of Dalles City. This photo by Carlton Watkins shows a view of the Dalles in 1867, looking west from Sunset Hill, which is today known as Cirrhosis Park. You can see some of the buildings down in the center of the photo. Those are the Fort Dalles military posts. Documented ownership of the land where the Umatilla House was located began when Winston D. Bigelow filed a claim on November 22nd, 1853 of 320 acres of land under the Land Donation Act. But a lawsuit resulted questioning whether Bigelow could lawfully claim this land, which had been a part of the Fort Dalles military reservation. The order for a military post along the Oregon route was vague as to the specific location. The required order and signature from the president was never issued. The Army failed to officially define and fix the military reservation limits until September 22nd, 1859, at what time the limit of the reserve was reduced to 1 square mile. Bigelow's claim was upheld by the Oregon Supreme Court. A trip to the vaults of the Wasco County Courthouse and some online research produced more interesting finds. Bigelow sold the property to Orlando Humason, who in turn sold several properties to Henry Perry Isaacs on January 5th, 1866 for $1. The land under the Umatilla House was designated as Lot 8, Block 2. The Umatilla House was located on the northeast corner of First and then called Main Street and Union Street in the Dalles. The site is now occupied in 2024 by the Riverfront Lewis and Clark Festival Park. The hotel was built by A.J. Nixon of the Nixon Brothers in 1857. In 1858, the Umatilla House, under A.J. Nixon proprietor, was listed as the city's leading hotel. The hotel was acquired by Henry Perry Isaacs sometime in 1861, after he and his wife Lucy, daughter of Colonel James Fulton, moved back to the Dalles from Philadelphia. Isaacs would eventually move to Walla Walla, leaving A.J. Nixon as the proprietor of the Umatilla House. Meanwhile, the Columbia Hotel in Portland was closed after it was decided the land was more valuable if used for other purposes, and the Sinnotts lost their lease. So Patrick and Nicholas Sinnott went to the gold diggings along the Salmon River in northern Idaho. At that time, gold fever was breaking out, and there was a lot of gold coming out of the Salmon River area in the 1850s and 1860s. They must not have been successful in the gold mines. Few men really struck it rich. When Sinnott came down from the mines, he stayed overnight at the Umatilla Hotel. It was July of 1862. He complained to the proprietor that the bed bugs had driven him out of his room, and he had had to take his blankets and sleep in the hall to get away from them. He was told, if you think you can run this hotel any better than I'm doing, you'd better take it. All right, said Sinnott. What are your terms? An offer was made that Sinnott thought was reasonable. He accepted it, and though he only had $40, he closed the bargain. On September 14th, 1863, Nicholas Byrne Sinnott took charge of the Umatilla House. There's a street scene from that era. Sinnott saw the possibilities of a first-class hotel with thousands of people passing up and down the river to the gold fields of the Inland Empire, each stopping over at the Dalles. The Umatilla House was the place from which the stagecoaches departed for all points in eastern Oregon and Washington, Idaho, and Utah. Sinnott still owned some furniture from the Columbia Hotel and had it shipped up to the Dalles, taking Dan Handley into partnership with him on September 7, 1863. When Sinnott and Handley took over the Umatilla House, there were less than 1,000 people living in the town, but there was always a large population coming and going. The hotel under new management soon took the lead. The photo was taken by Carlton Watkins in 1863. And if you enlarge it so you can see detail, it is, I believe, the only photograph of the original Umatilla House. Which one is it? Well, there's the Mill Creek Bridge stretching across there, and I believe the Umatilla House is not the little thin one right next to the bridge, but possibly the one next to it. I'm not really sure which of those two buildings it is, but I can guarantee you that I've never found another photo of the original Umatilla House. Their efforts were noticed in the Dalles 1866 Times Mountaineer improvements of the Umatilla House. And see, I think I need to go back one. There we go. Improvements. Messrs. Handley and Sinnott have made some handsome improvements to the Umatilla House this spring in order to accommodate the wants of the traveling public. But during the past week, they've capped the climax by the addition of 10 beautifully furnished rooms in that part of the building formerly occupied as a cigar store and tailor shop. The enterprise displayed by those gentlemen in fitting up the Umatilla House to its present state of comfort is certainly commendable, for which they deserve and receive a fair share of public support. The sale of the Umatilla House was completed when H.P. Isaacs and his wife signed a quitclaim deed handing the ownership of the hotel over to Handley and Sinnott for $5,000. The deed filed for record on May 14, 1867. In addition to the 1863 marriage of Kate and Daniel, another bride came to the Umatilla House family. On June 17, 1865, Nicholas Sinnott was married in San Francisco to Bridget Mary Brass, who was also a native of Ireland. There's very little written about either woman. A note on Bridget Sinnott said she was endowed with fine qualities of mind and heart, and theirs proved an ideal union. A beautiful woman of stately manner, Mrs. Sinnott was always tastefully and elegantly attired, and each day her husband escorted her to the hotel for dinner. The discovery of gold in eastern Oregon and Idaho boosted the Dalles into its heyday. The steamers from Portland ran at full capacity with passengers to the Dalles. The streets were full of pack trains, stages, and wagons headed for the mines. The enormous steamboat traffic on the Columbia River was transferred to the Dalles, and from that point, freight trains departed for their heavy trips into the interior of the country. In those days, hotels were of first importance, with saloons and blacksmith shops running a close second. North of the Umatilla House, the riverside was the incline, so named because steamers could stop almost at the door of the Umatilla House at high water. The Dalles Celilo portage trains stopped at the Umatilla House. A railroad trestle crossed Mill Creek, which was much wider than it is now. The proprietors donated a ticket office and baggage room to the OR&N Railroad Company. The track passed directly in front of the Umatilla House. There were no dining cars at the time, and train schedules were deliberately set to arrive at stations at mealtime. When the train stopped to let passengers off to eat, either Handley or Sinnott would be out on the platform ringing a large brass handbell. Handley would point to the front door and the restaurant with his thumb, jerking his hand over his shoulder while swinging the gong, making sure that they knew where to go to eat. The year of 1862 was known as the hard winter, when snow fell to a depth of 3 feet and laid on all winter from Christmas until spring. No whining about the snow we've had lately. When the snow began to melt, the river flooded. Front and Second Streets and even 3rd Street were submerged, the highest stage being 48 feet and 10 inches above watermark. The second recorded flood year in the Dalles was 1866. That doesn't mean there weren't floods before, it just means nobody had been recording them. The majority of the guests patronizing the Umatilla House were stock, mining, railroad, and steamboat men. Scattered among them were military men from camps and forts, and the usual numbers of adventurers, gamblers, and hard characters. Surprisingly, the Umatilla was mostly free of brawls. Only one shooting scrape there is on record. Charlie Mitzdorf, a bartender, was killed by a man he was trying to throw out. However, the index to Wasco County Court records shows that Dan Handley demonstrated that fighting Irish spirit more than once. 3 times in 1865, Daniel Handley was engaged in fighting within the city limits. There isn't a lot of detail about the court cases, but he was fined twice and involved in a 3rd case where the other person was found guilty of throwing the first punch. Handley was a big man, eventually tipping in the scales at over 300 pounds. I would guess he would have been a likely candidate to serve as the bouncer for saloon guests who overindulged in spirits. Yet it was also said that Major Dan Handley was a noble man with his heart in his hand, and he had the same smile for the rich and poor alike. Daniel and Kate Handley had 2 children, a son, John Edward, and a daughter, Elizabeth, whom they called Lizzie, born November 16, 1863. Lizzie died at a young age of what we don't know. Her grave in the St. Peter's Catholic Cemetery is marked Elizabeth, daughter of D.N.C. Handley, died May 7, 1867, aged 3 years, 6 months, and 21 days. God took thee in his mercy, a lamb untasked, untried. Again in 1871, another flood year occurred in which considerable damage was done to the business district. This was also the year of the first disastrous fire, which broke out August 17, 1871, near the Globe Hotel, where the French Bank was later built. Fully half of the town was swept out of existence. On June 23, 1876, the Columbia River once again flooded. At 4:00 a.m., the river was 51 feet, 3 inches above the low water mark. On October 27, 1878, another fire originating in the Korma Saddle Shop on 2nd Street burned all the property between Federal and Washington Streets below 4th, including the original Umatilla House building. When the old Umatilla House was burning, it made a roaring big fire. Charlie Durbin had just rode in from his horse ranch at Antelope, and in the crowd across the street watching the blaze, he found Colonel Sinnott just roaring with laughter and plumb full of hilarious halloos. "What's the provocation for all the hilarity, Colonel?" asked Charlie. "What is there to laugh at when you see your own big building burning up? What in the hell's the use?" Colonel Sinnott slapped Charlie in the back and said, "The bugs, Charlie, the bugs. For years I've been fighting off those damn bed bugs, but they refuse to be killed off. Now we've got them. No bugs can still bite after coming through as hot of a fire as this. And lucky it is there are no fire escapes for them to come down hand over hand. Hooray, hooray!" Sinnott and Handley began to rebuild the hotel. Business was good and they had almost completely paid for the new building, but before the hotel was finished or all the furniture was moved in, another fire swept that part of the city on May 21st, 1879. Within 3 hours, with winds whipping the flames into fury, the greater portion of the business district in the Dalles was laid to ash. Once more, the Umatilla House was a pile of smoking ashes, and nearly everything the firm owned was destroyed, entailing a cost of $35,000 to $40,000 with no insurance. The embers had hardly cooled before the plans for a new building were being prepared, but the fire had left Sinnott and Handley almost penniless. They had spent $75,000 and borrowed all they could, and the local merchants could give them no more credit. Hearing of their misfortune, Corbett and McClay of Portland, a wholesale grocer, offered to stake them to merchandise and hardware. Chu Ki, the Chinese cook, loaned them $18,000. Dr. Shackelford, an old-time Army doctor, loaned them $15,000. Dan Lieber, the only milkman in town, loaned them between 10 and 15,000. The Oregon Furniture Company refinanced the order, and it all had to come around the horn, which took nearly a year to get the furniture. Oregon Lumber Company furnished the lumber without cash. A large part of the money to rebuild the Umatilla House came from the railroad men. At the time, there was no bank in the Dalles, and the railroaders kept their money in the large fireproof safe at the hotel, drawing on it as they needed. Some of it was in rolls of gold dollars. The hotel men asked the railroaders if they could use their money to rebuild, and they all agreed. Sinnott and Handley then mortgaged their homes and built the last and fanciest Umatilla House at a cost of $91,000. A lot of money for back in those days. A large crew of carpenters completed the building in about 4 months. When the third and final Umatilla House opened for business October 25th, 1879, it was a luxury hotel. Sinnott said they opened up the door and borrowed $5,000 from French and Company Bank to make change. Within 3 years, they didn't owe a cent, so business was good. The new Umatilla House was a 3-story structure. They had increased its capacity by building a new wing on the east end of the hotel, giving them accommodations for 400 guests and the claim of being the largest hotel north of San Francisco. A year after the fire, on May 20th, 1880, the Dalles Chronicle reported Handley and Sinnott had erected the new Umatilla House, a solid 3-story wooden building, 95 feet by 120 feet, containing 130 sleeping rooms with a large and commodious billiard room, office, sample rooms, dining hall, and kitchen with storerooms and woodyard, a basement, in all accommodation for 400 guests. The rooms were fitted up with walnut and ash furniture, together with a stove in each suite. There were 2 baths, which was an opposing ratio for the time and place, plus a toilet in the basement. Be glad you didn't have to stand in that line. A broad veranda shaded the front. Under the railing of the sidewalk, down a steep bank and under the hotel was the cellar basement. Ice was brought in by horseback from the ice caves on Mount Adams. The hotel had ice cut on the river during the winter and stored it under the building and at the rear in sawdust-filled rooms. One entered the Umatilla House on First Street into the spacious office with its heavily carved black walnut counter. The keyboard with its 2 carved ducks and goat's head hung on the wall behind the counter. You can see it there on the wall if you look. On the back, on the black walnut desk was a large slate with space marked for 120 rooms. The Umatilla House was lighted by gilded chandeliers bearing kerosene-burning lamps hung from the ceilings. Old Tom, their trusted veteran Chinese housekeeper, kept them shined and filled. There were lamps in every room and lobby. The bar and dining rooms each had a huge stove with a patented metal container around the stovepipe to furnish hot water. The doors to the left led to the dining room. They employed as many as 16 waiters and 12 cooks, and the dining room seated as many as 250 people without moving a chair. The house fed as many as 1,600 people at meal times throughout the day. Daniel Handley was a generously proportioned fellow who weighed 320 pounds and was a liberal patron of his own table and bar. At meal times, he dragged his special made-to-order chair that fit his bulk to the door of the dining room and acted as cashier. The price of meals were 2 bits, 25 cents if you don't know what a bit was, and 4 bits, 50 cents, depending on whether you sat at the commercial table or the table for the general public.
which meant working men like farmhands, mule skinners, and gold miners. Meals and room were $1 a day or $20 a month. To traveling men or drummers, meals were 50 cents and $2 for room and board. Just probably making sure they're not gonna skip out. They made sure they got paid. Venison, wild goose, royal Chinook salmon were some of the specialties of the Umatilla House. They had a butcher shop, the largest in town, to prepare steaks, roasts, fish, and fowl for the kitchen. They used $600 worth of meat a month. Enormous quantities of beef, ham, and bacon were bought. They stocked 4 tons of ham and bacon at the time, and several hundred dozen eggs were in the storerooms. Entire garden crops were bargained for use in the dining room. The hotel took all the garden produce produced by local gardeners, including the Chinese, all that they could raise. Their supply room was as big as a grocery store. Here's an example of the Christmas menu for the Umatilla House. Notice the menu of oyster or turtle soup, filet of salmon, pig's feet, boiled queen ham with champagne sauce, ox tongue with mint sauce, pig's head with sauerkraut. Yum. On festive nights, the dining room was cleared and used as a ballroom, and many were the gay parties held there during all seasons. The second floor gallery overlooked the Columbia. The main entrance led into an elegant lobby with walls covered in brocade and gilt, a magnificent glass chandelier overhead, and custom furnished carved furnishings. On the second floor was the ladies' parlor. The parlor of the Umatilla House has been the setting for many a wedding. Happy young couples came from all directions to be married under the glittering lights and before the golden framed mirror. And if weather was fair and the steamers running on schedule, the event was topped off by a sail down the Great River to Portland. The doors to the right of the lobby led to the bar. In the rear of the bar room were billiard and card tables. Those who remember when soldiers, stockmen, and settlers crowded the Umatilla House state that as many as 200 men at one time were often seen in the bar room. The Umatilla House bar room made even more money than the rent from the rooms or the profit from the meals. The hotel took in hundreds of thousands of dollars. Sinnott kept thousands of dollars in the safe at any one time. A roulette wheel graced the billiard room. Ed Wood, chief special agent for the Union Pacific, reported to the Oregonian, "I have seen poker games there when there would be $10,000 on the table at any one time." The basement held a huge storeroom for liquors and cigars, guarded by 2 huge brass padlocks as large as saucers. The cellar at times held as much as 2,500 gallons of whiskey. Major Handley and Tom Kelly, the bartender, would go down to the basement and open a 100-gallon barrel of 100-proof whiskey. They would put in a gallon of glycerin and 4 gallons of water. That was apparently to make the mix just right. During the process, they would continue to taste the whiskey to see if they'd hit the just right mix yet. Generally, by the time it was right, Handley and Tom would be flat on the floor. As this was a daily occurrence, Sinnott would send someone down to the basement just before meals and train time to wake Handley. Sinnott himself drank very little, putting a few spoonfuls of whiskey in a glass of water when he did imbibe. An immense register lay open on the front desk, and from time to time signatures of famous men were written there. Colonel Sinnott was known far and wide for his remarkable ability for impressing the appearance of people upon his memory, so that even years afterwards, should he meet the guest again, he could recall the name of the person and where and when he had met them. I wish I had that skill. Sinnott and Handley were hosts for many notables. World travelers and other distinguished visitors included Lord Lichfield of England, Mark Twain, Thomas Alva Edison and his wife, and George Francis Train, whose motto was "Round the World in 80 Days." I might point out that picture is from the one that was here in the original courthouse. We found it this morning. It's sitting right here on the table. So afterwards, you might come give it a look. I encourage not to flip through the pages, but the original register is there. That one's from 1906, so you're not going to find Mark Twain's signature. Renowned fighters John Sullivan and James Corbett stopped there on different occasions. And oftentimes while they were eating, the hundreds of fans would peer through the window to watch them eat in the restaurant. The old registers were a veritable who's who of Oregon and included signatures from Reverend Thomas Condon, abolitionist, Henry Ward Beecher, Dr. John McLaughlin, Governor George Wood, Senator John Mitchell, Captain Ainsworth, R.R. Thompson, and John Gates. In later years, Susan B. Anthony stopped there. From the veranda of the Umatilla House, Malcolm Moody made his first speech after being nominated for Congress. From the same veranda, General U.S. Grant, railroad tycoon Henry Villard, and General W.T. Sherman spoke to the citizens of the Dalles. President Hayes and later President Harrison were greeted there by citizens. They had rules and regulations, as you can see in the green thing posted, which included, among many other restrictions, it is expected that parents shall exercise proper care over their children and not allow them to make a playground of the halls and corridors. Some things never change. Politics were a hot topic back in the 1800s. Colonel Sinnott was a staunch black Republican, and Major Handley was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. This is back in the days when Republicans were liberals and Democrats were conservative. What a mixed-up world we live in now. The Umatilla House was a rendezvous of political parties, conventions, holding sessions a week at a time, both day and night. The political future of Wasco County was built up and carried through in this hotel. Sinnott and Handley took an active interest in state and local politics. Sinnott was an informed authority on the political situation in the state and in forecasting election results. Dan Handley served on Dalles City Council in 1866 and again from 1881 to 1883. Nicholas Sinnott served as councilman from 1876 to 1878. At a time when two factions in the county were striving for supremacy, a gentleman from Dufur was delegated by one party to ask the colonel about certain political turns which were to occur. The colonel, noted for his ability to prophesy coming events of this nature, his opinion was valued. The delegate stayed at the Umatilla House for 3 days in an effort to wrest from the colonel certain details. When his stay had terminated and the gentleman was on his way home, someone asked him how he had made out with the colonel. He replied, "I guess I made out fine. The colonel found out everything I knew, but I didn't find out anything I wanted to know." This showed conclusively that the man the colonel was, his ability to juggle conversation, his political strength, and his perhaps private keeping of that information, which is why he was so trusted. There are a couple of stories in particular that center around life in the Umatilla House. I think everyone's heard the one that Colonel Sinnott became known for claiming salmon were so plentiful in the Columbia that one could walk across the river on their backs. Another of Colonel Sinnott's famous fish stories involved humpback salmon. The first one known to be caught near the Dalles. The salmon, unlike the ordinary type, had a large rounded hump just back of its head. The colonel, believing the fish of sufficient interest, displayed it in the front of the building. Linus Hubbard, who at that time was working for O.D. Taylor, an old-time Baptist preacher and founder of Grand Dalles, came down to the hotel to take a picture of the fish. Thinking he could have a bit more fun from his work by bringing the fish more prominently displayed in the foreground. A first picture was taken of the colonel, who was not an expert in photography perspective, standing several feet to the rear of the post with John Mitchell, who ran the newspaper, which of course made the fish look very large. A second picture was taken with the colonel standing with John Mitchell several feet in front of the post, which made the fish look very small. Some rhyming Webster penned the following poem. Colonel Sinnott went a-fishing not very long ago and caught a fish that looked like this, at least he told them so. He invited all his neighbors to come and take a look and sent for D.C. Heron to have its picture took. The fame of the colonel's fish spread throughout the town. It brought the folks from many miles around. But when the crowd had assembled, the colonel's fish had looked like this. The colonel said, "My, how it's dwindled." Another story that is specific to the Umatilla House tells about how they would buy several hundred dozen eggs packed in oatmeal in the fall. Once, Judd Fish, Sinnott's son-in-law, bought 300 dozen eggs from Matt Peasley, who was a tavern keeper at the Big Klickitat River Bridge on the old road from Goldendale to Glenwood. Peasley had a flock of chickens and a surplus of eggs. To store the eggs, he was hard-boiling them and packing them in straw. He was scratching his head on how to dispose of them, so he hauled them 50 miles to the Umatilla House and offered them for sale. He carefully packed a couple of layers of fresh eggs on top of the hard-boiled eggs. Judd took a sample egg to the bartender, Tom Kelly. He broke it open, saw it was fresh, so Judd bought the eggs for 4 cents a dozen. But when a Chinese chef tried to crack one open on the fry pan, it bounced out of his hand and rolled across the floor. He sent for Judd, who discovered the problem. He put the egg on the meat block and whacked it in 2 parts with a butcher knife. That goggle-eyed yap hard-boiled those eggs. He did it to get even with me for a gag I once pulled on him. Nicholas and Bridget Sinnott were the parents of 4 children: Molly, Nicholas J., Roger B., and Catherine. Catherine unfortunately died at the age of 7, but Molly grew into a beautiful and accomplished young woman who married Judd Fish, and they later became co-owners of the Umatilla House. Roger Sinnott worked as a lawyer in Portland, Oregon. Nicholas J. Sinnott was elected U.S. Congressman from Oregon in 1813 to 1829. Growing up at the Umatilla House, that would have been 1913 to 1929. Growing up at the Umatilla House is where Congressman Sinnott spent his boyhood and got his political training. Other businesses operated within the walls of the Umatilla House. The ticket and baggage office for the OR&N Railroad was in the building. In later years, the Western Union Telegraph office was located there, as well as a barber shop, even a gift shop. Engbert Ed Nicholson was a steward in 1869, his brother the night clerk. An immigrant from Germany, he came to the Dalles in 1867 from New York. Nicholson later opened a book and stationery store that is still in operation today. It's the oldest bookstore in Oregon, operating under the name of Clint's Booksellers. The summer of 1880, another flood inundated the Dalles. Heavy winter snows and a cold spring were followed by a sudden rise in temperatures in late June and early July. For 2 weeks, the snow melt-laden waters of the Columbia lapped the front portion of the town and drove business back to other streets. The Times Mountaineer reported on June 29, 1880, the water began to rise and kept gradually creeping over the surface of the town. Misters Handley and Sinnott were determined to stand at their post, and at 11 o'clock Sunday night, when the water of the river was up to the floor of the Umatilla House, we inquired whether they would move. No, they said, we shall have the false floor raised about 2 or 3 feet and try to weather it through. By July 2nd, 1880, the water reached 48 feet, 7.5 inches above low water. This was the highest point gained during the flood of this year. July 6th, the Mountaineer reported, the present week will be known as the Dalles Flood Week. Another fire burned through the downtown area in 1891. There's a reason most of the downtown buildings are built of brick and not wood. This fire gratefully spared the Umatilla House. However, the ever-present danger of fire made everyone understandably nervous. On Saturday, May 13th, 1893, an article published in the Dalles Times-Mountaineer told this story. The guests at the Umatilla House were aroused from their slumbers this morning by loud cries of, "Fire! Fire! The town is on fire!" The hotel man, notably alarmed, ran to the guest room, looked out, and saw no greater phenomena than an eastern Oregon sun rising, gilding the river and the housetops and reflecting its rays on numerous plate glass windows. When it was explained to the man, he was the most crestfallen individual in town. He apologized for his expression of fear, said he came on the midnight train from Portland, and when he awoke this morning, saw the glare, thought certainly it was a conflagration. He hadn't seen the sun for 6 or 7 months and had forgotten its appearance in a clear atmosphere. In 1889, a tragedy hit the Umatilla House family. Daniel and Kate's only son and last remaining child, John Edward Handley, died February 16th in Denver, Colorado. John Edward was only 23 years old. He was buried here in the Dalles at St. Peter's Catholic Cemetery. Major Dan Handley and his wife Kate lived in room 11, and Daniel died there November 18th, 1890, following several weeks of a painful illness. He was a very large man, requiring an appropriately large-sized coffin. The coffin had to be tipped on its side to get it through the door. Coming out bearing the late Major's body, it was of course impossible to tip the coffin back on its side, so a door jamb had to be removed. He was buried in St. Peter's Catholic Cemetery next to his beloved children. You can see Lizzie's grave right there to the left. After Daniel Handley's death, Judd Fish, husband of Molly Sinnott, entered a partnership with his father-in-law in 1892, becoming a co-owner of the hotel. Fish recalled that when he entered the business, he opened the safe and found it full of currency. Upon inquiring, he found that the money belonged to Mr. Sinnott. He asked that the money be counted before he took over the clerical job, and it was revealed that there was more than $13,000 in currency at the time. Judd also found a bundle of IOUs dating back to 1879, amounting to more than $16,000, none of them ever repaid. The accounts ran from a few cents to $900. Fish had full control of the business end of the hotel for 15 years. He put in steam heat, electric lights, and call bells. Rates were $1.50 and $2 per day, with baths an additional 50 cents. In 1894, severe weather and flooding struck the entire West Coast, and the Dalles was no exception. On June 2nd, 1894, the Dalles Chronicle reported, "The floods are not confined to the Columbia, but have extended all over the West Coast. The Fraser is higher than ever known, while the Sacramento and streams of Southern California are raging. 3 persons were drowned in the streets of Los Angeles. In Colorado, every stream is a torrent. The Dalles Chronicle stated, at noon, First Street was out of sight, being underwater from Mill Creek to the grade at the east end. The water measured 3 inches higher at noon than at 6 o'clock this morning. This morning, the water had taken possession of 3rd Street from Port West down by the Union Pacific, where the tops of the coal cars are just visible. That black streak in the front, that's the top of a railroad car. The Umatilla House put in another false floor last night, which is its limit for the lower story. Should the rise continue, the range will be moved upstairs and business kept on as usual. Judd Fish said he's in it to stay as long as the roof is dry. An iron pot floated up the street to our office door this morning, which convinced us it was time to move. Iron pots floating upstream indicate extremely high water. The man with the longest legs now wears the broadest smile because it's further from his body to the street. The Baldwin Opera House was next to the Umatilla House. After the flood of 1894, Fish had to remove the veranda. The 1894 flood was not the last one. During the flood of 1897, the Dalles Weekly Chronicle ran an article on May 22nd titled, All About a Cat. The Umatilla House boasts of a small family of cats which make their home in the big basement. Among these was a big white one that was a particular favorite of Stewart Wilson. The rising waters caused them to seek quarters on beams and sills. Yesterday, Wilson heard one of them crying mournfully. He went to the lower back porch and leaned over the railing trying to see where the complaining cat was. He couldn't see, so he stretched out a little bit further and then a little bit further again. He thought he could catch a glimpse of her, but not so sure, so he uncoupled another inch, which was just half an inch too much. Gravity began to work. Slowly his heels started skyward, while his frantic hands grabbed vainly after some saving hold, and he ended up striking the water head on and disappeared from view. Mr. Brooks was examining the gauge in the river a short distance above, was astounded to find Wilson, when he came to the surface, spouting water like a young whale. As he came dripping up the incline with the big white apron clinging to him, he looked like a short-haired mermaid. The cat escaped. Colonel Nicholas Sinnott remained an active, vigorous man for some time, passing away 6 years after his longtime friend and business partner. He died October 21st, 1897, at St. Vincent's Hospital in Portland at the age of 65 years old. That's younger than I am. The funeral of Colonel Sinnott was held from the local Catholic church, which of course would have been St. Peter's Landmark. Never before in the history of the Dalles had such a large funeral procession been known. The hearse, led by the Dalles Concert Band, played a funeral march, had already reached the cemetery before many other vehicles had even crossed Mill Creek Bridge. By actual count, over 100 teams followed the remains, with many more mourners on foot. He was buried at the St. Peter Cemetery not far from his former partner, Daniel Handley. It was said in the Dalles Time Mountaineer, in the death of Colonel Sinnott, the Dalles has suffered an irretrievable loss. He will be missed by all, though his memory will remain fresh with those whose privilege it was to know and number him as a friend. Colonel Sinnott's son, Roger, an attorney, was in partnership at the time with Alfred Bennett, a well-known the Dalles judge. You all know the Bennett Williams house. That was where Alfred Bennett once lived. Roger resigned this position on his father's death to help Judd Fish, his brother-in-law, run the Umatilla House. After Sinnott's death, the changes to the hotel were not lost on the public. The Dalles Chronicle reported in September of 1897, Umatilla House office is being changed so that old-timers feel lost on entering it. The counter has been moved up to the front, the big safe placed in a corner of the bar room, the door between being removed, and everything else is moved. Sounds like the grocery food basket upset that happens at Fred Meyer all the time. Mary Bridget Sinnott died November 30th, 1902. Catherine Kate Byrne Handley died in 1906. She was said to have been a gracious and generous Catholic woman. She was attended to by a grandniece the last 4 years of her life. The date of her obit was August 20th, 1906. She was survived by a sister in Wexford County, Ireland, while her 2 sisters in San Francisco, her 2 children, and her husband had all preceded her in death. The glory of the Umatilla House declined in large part due to progress. With the coming of the telephone, it was no longer necessary to meet in person to communicate. Railroads installed Pullman diner cars, so trains stopped at the station instead of the hotel. Steamboats lost passengers as they competed against trains that weren't hampered by the rapids at the Dalles. Stagecoaches were replaced by automobiles. Businesses, tired of coping with seasonal floodwaters, had finally moved from Main Street to 2nd Street. Judd Fish sold his share of the business to Thomas Crofton in 1906. The Sunday Oregonian reported December 16th of 1906, but the transfer of this hotel was the last link that connected the old hostelry with what might be appropriately termed the age of romance in Oregon. Fish served the town as councilman, treasurer, water commissioner, mayor, and recorder. Tom Crofton, having bought the hotel in December of 1906, had his challenges. When the Hotel Dalles was opened in 1909, the glory that was once the Umatilla House faded into memory. Tom Crofton kept the Umatilla House going until 1919. The Dalles Chronicle reported May 1st of 1924, the old Umatilla House, landmark of the early days of Wasco County and known from Nome to San Francisco as a palatial hostelry of the time, may be sold under the sheriff's hammer in satisfaction of a lien by Wasco County. The old building was traded by Tom Crofton for a beautiful home in San Diego. The Californian made the trade without seeing the old hotel. Got some swampland you want to sell? When he did, he decided to raise it and salvage as much material as he could. An article in the Dalles Chronicle, June 17, 1927, said, "Even in rooms where the plaster is falling from the walls and where debris litters the floor, one may catch glimpses of former splendor. A wonderful gold frame mirror, which must have cost hundreds of dollars, even in those days of low prices, was purchased this week by a local man for $5. Other relics of a bygone day were purchased for presentation to the Historical Society, which would have been the Fort Dalles Museum at the time. Stored indiscriminately in the large room at the north of the building are paintings that once graced the wall. The Umatilla House was torn down on June 26, 1929 by its new owner, Benjamin Salisbury. An article published in the Dalles Chronicle on July 3rd reported, "Raising of Umatilla House now underway. All furniture, including beds, curtains, dresses, and commodes, has been moved from the upper floors to the hotel lobby and dining room and will be sold soon. We know a few of those pieces, bought at auction, ended up in a little log hunting cabin in eastern Oregon." The only remaining traces of the Umatilla House were scattered odd pieces of its costly furnishings purchased here and there by those who valued their historic significance or their beautiful workmanship. The Columbia Gorge Discovery Center has an old pump organ and one of the wall clocks, as well as a spittoon and some keys that came from the Umatilla House. Fort Dalles has the old keyboard, a chair, a register, a beer spigot, and the old Umatilla House bus. There's the register, and there's the old Umatilla House bus. The chairs used on the veranda at the Umatilla House are now at Fort Dalles Museum. The keyboard of walnut with its goat's head and pendant mallard ducks is now located there as well. One of the Umatilla House guest book registers is now part of the collections at both Fort Dalles Museum, one at the Discovery, and another is on the table right here that belongs to the original Wasco County Courthouse. Paintings once graced the walls of Mount Hood, the Columbia River, and the elk standing at bay. There was my clue for what I grew up around. The Brunswick and Balk billiard table mounted atop majestic lions there's one of them, graces the IOF Fellowship Hall in the Dalles above Pioneer Electric, along with the billiard balls and cues and the metal string they use to keep score. So if you get a close-up look at those lions, they're pretty spectacular. Now that company made more than pool tables. What happened of the dual twin virgins back bars that were salvaged from the building and over the years moved several times from one site to the next? The often repeated story about the back bar made the claim that the twin virgins back bars were hand carved in Milan, Italy out of mahogany wood and shipped at great expense around Cape Horn to its final destination in Oregon. We know that this back bar originally went to the Oxbow Coffee House. One back bar went to the Oxbow Coffee House and Restaurant in Prairie City, Oregon, 13 miles east of John Day. They still have it there. The other stayed in the Dalles, where there was a feature at the Turf Tavern, operated by Don and Ralph Buce. The Turf Tavern was located where Zim's now stands. The back bar was later sold to the Portage Inn in 1974 for $2,500, where it graced the Portage Lounge for many years. The Portage Inn was eventually sold and renamed the Shiloh Inn. There's a photo found in the kitchen of the Shiloh Inn that shows the back bar in the early 1900s. But why do none of the photos of the Umatilla House bars from the 1800s show the Twin Virgins back bar? I could never understand that. In May of 1920, I was contacted by someone who told me that MKM Hotels had bought the Shiloh Inn and was remodeling and planning to move the back bar. I contacted them and suggested the back bar come to our museum. They were supportive of keeping it in the Dalles and graciously offered to donate it to the Discovery Center. But by the time I learned about the change, the back bar had already been removed by construction workers in preparation for the remodel, and it was already loaded out onto a truck. By the time it came to the Discovery Center, it was in pieces. It would take a lot of money to restore it, and someone with expertise. I began doing research. Carolyn, I see you with the look of horror. It's still in pieces. I found an expert online and contacted Lou Marshak from Du Bois, Wyoming. Marshak does professional restoration of vintage bars, pool tables, and slot machines. He was well familiar with that particular model of a back bar. I told him the local story of it being made in Italy, carved from mahogany, and arriving on a ship that sailed around the Horn. He laughed and told me every vintage bar has a similar romantic story when it came around the Horn. What I learned was the local history on that back bar was not even remotely true. He told me the truth was The back bar mirror frame was manufactured in the USA by Brunswick Bulk Colander Company that made the pool tables, and the bar was listed in their 1904 catalog as the Los Angeles model. He sent me a copy of the catalog page as proof. It was made in the USA of quarter sawed golden oak and birch with a mahogany stain, and most likely arrived in the early 1900s by railroad. Having seen the back of the bar, I have to verify it's not solid mahogany. The finish is definitely a wood stain. I also learned that restoration would be expensive, perhaps costing over $20,000, so the bar has been quietly stored at the museum until we find a champion to do the restoration. We have vowed never to send it out of the Dalles, so it may not be available to the public now, but we hope someday to get it back where the public can view it again. But here's a puzzler. This is a rabbit alert. One of the more interesting wild hares I had to track down was the conflicting information on the date Daniel Handley died. Handley, like many Irish immigrants, was a Catholic. He and his family were buried in the St. Peter's Catholic Cemetery. But I found a jumble of conflicting information. A transcribed copy of his obituary gives the year as 1890 of his death. A typewritten transcription of an article said he died in 1891. Also refers to him as Dennis Handley, which was not his name. His wife obituary gave the year as 1890, but his headstone says he died in November 19th, 1891. There were multiple newspaper records about his death. Looking in 1891, in the November and December of that year, there was no mention of his death. But in December of 1890, and several times early in 1891, there are public notices on his estate. One newspaper can have an incorrect dateline, but the chances of 6 or 7 publications all listing the year wrong on the dateline and the content are pretty small. And here is some additional evidence. After I gave this talk to the Wasco County Historical Society in October of 2019, I walked into my office the next week to find that library volunteer Sandy Buce had left me a photocopy sent to her by a man who was a stamp cancellation collector. It held a letter about the Dalles, and he had sent a photocopy of it along, so thinking we might find it of interest. The letter, coincidentally, was from Dr. William Shackelford, who was the attending physician at the death of Daniel Handley, as well as a good friend. It was written to Daniel's brother John in Pennsylvania, Judge John Handley in Scranton, Pennsylvania. The stamp cancellation bears the date of November 1890. The letter was dated November 19th, 1890. The letter begins, "It is my painful duty to inform you of the death of your brother Daniel Handley, which occurred last evening about 9 o'clock. That means that Handley died in 1890 on November 18th, not November 19th, 1891. The only conclusion you can come to is that the headstone date is wrong. And to back that up, I noticed, "May his soul rest in peace." My original thought was, clearly, this is a sign the stonecutter was perhaps tipping some Irish whiskey. Yet, other headstones like that of John Baldwin from the Baldwin Saloon have a similar inscription, but it uses the word pace as part of the Latin requiescat and pace, which I don't speak Latin, so pardon my pronunciation, which is the Latin blessing that means rest in peace. Most other headstones don't mix the Latin and the English together in one sentence. I asked local undertaker Mark Powell if he is used to seeing the word pace on headstones in cemeteries. He replied, only in Catholic cemeteries. Solving that mystery doesn't answer why the wrong date and year are on Handley's headstone. It just proves that you can't take everything you see in print as fact, even if it's written in stone. So here we are, admiring those amazing people who once helped and shaped the Dalles into the community it is today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Maybe take a walk through the old cemeteries and send a little prayer of thanks to those who played a big part in shaping our town's history. And remember, you and I are helping to shape the history of today and tomorrow. Our time is now. We are the community. Together, we are the rabbits who will make our mark on history. Thank you.
Does anyone have questions?
Oh yeah, you're gonna have to shout because I can't hear Scott. I'm an old deaf person.
So is that bar story the same for the Baldwin? I heard the same story for the Baldwin bar, is that the same?
I can only do one voice at a time, people.
Sorry.
I think
There was
she's
a
at-
photo of the dining room,
Uh-huh.
and in the middle of the dining room was a cylinder made out of steel of some kind.
I believe that was the heating pipe, the stove pipe that heated the room with the cylinder that I had to really work to tear this top down. That was a patented device that allowed them to put water in it so they would have hot water ready.
Your petroglyph at the very beginning, the rock that you showed up on the
Oh,
screen.
that wasn't a petroglyph. That's actually a picture I took of a rock that was down between Dodson and Multnomah Falls. And somebody had spent a lot of time balancing it on the tip. That was the actual rock that was about this high and about that wide. And I wish I had my friend who had gone with me that day. I wish I'd taken a picture of her standing next to it for comparison, but it sat there like that for a couple of days, or a couple of months. Any other questions?
I think Sandy had a question.
We heard that same story about the bar and the Baldwin coming around the horn, is that also, you know?
She's asking about the bar in the Baldwin. Did you know anything about the history of that barn? Bar?
Fire in the Baldwin?
No, the bar that's in the Baldwin. The bar, that
We
bar
heard
in the
this-
Baldwin.
Oh,
I heard the same story
that
about,
was not on my radar. I don't know about that one, so Mark Linebarger would have to answer that.
I heard that was billed as a copy of from an old picture.
Well, I know you can take a picture of it and show it to Lou Marshak in Wyoming. He's still in business, so if you send him a picture, he might be able to identify where that came from.
All right, well, thank you all for coming. We'll do the raffle. We'll have Susan draw tickets.